Listen to me very carefully, because what I am about to tell you is not a political opinion. It is not a partisan talking point. It is not the kind of comfortable, carefully managed message you hear from a press secretary standing behind a podium in a freshly pressed suit. What I am about to tell you is the truth about power, about strategy, about what happens when a nation confuses noise for strength, and what the real cost of that confusion looks like when it finally arrives at your door. I have spent decades in uniform. I have planned operations in the dark, in silence, with lives on the line. I have sat in rooms where the wrong decision meant body bags, where the absence of a strategy wasn't an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. And I am telling you right now, as someone who has studied the anatomy of military failure at the highest levels, what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not a victory narrative. It is a warning. And if you are not paying attention, you are going to be blindsided by consequences that are already in motion. Consequences that will land not in some distant theater of war, but in your grocery store, at your gas pump, and in the financial foundation beneath everything you have built. So stay with me, because what comes next is going to challenge the story you have been told. Let's start with the fundamentals, because the fundamentals always matter. In every military operation I have ever been part of, there are three non-negotiable pillars: a clear objective, a coherent strategy to achieve it, and an honest assessment of the enemy's capabilities. Remove any one of those pillars, and what you have is not an operation. What you have is theater. Expensive, dangerous, potentially catastrophic theater, but theater nonetheless. Now let me ask you a direct question. What is the objective in the Strait of Hormuz? Is it to open a critical shipping lane to the free flow of global commerce? Is it to destroy Iran's military capability? Is it to force a nuclear deal? Is it to support the realignment of power in the Middle East? Is it to send a message to China? I have listened carefully to every press conference, every briefing, every statement coming out of the Pentagon and the Oval Office. And the honest answer is that the objective appears to shift depending on who is speaking and what hour of the day it is. That is not strategy. That is improvisation dressed in the language of strength. The blockade was announced with force and confidence. The language was sharp and commanding. The message was clear. We are in control. Nobody is challenging this. It is like a wall of steel. Now, I understand the value of projecting confidence. In leadership, in combat, confidence is contagious. It moves through your ranks and stiffens spines. But there is a critical difference between genuine confidence and performance. Genuine confidence is backed by results. Performance is not. And when the results do not match the performance, the gap between them becomes the space where credibility goes to die. Here is what the data tells us, independent of any press conference. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital choke points on the planet, through which roughly 13 to 15 million barrels of oil flow every single day under normal conditions, is effectively closed. 2 ships passed through on Monday. Tuesday saw a near-total standstill. The price of crude oil has risen by approximately 82% since this conflict began. Gasoline stockpiles inside the United States are already at the lowest levels ever recorded for this point in the calendar year, and we are heading into summer, the highest demand driving season of the year. 70% of American farmers have reportedly stated they can no longer afford fertilizer at current prices. Let that sink in. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what I am about to explain, because this is where most people, most Americans, are missing the full picture. We are not simply dealing with a military standoff. We are dealing with a systemic economic shock that is compounding in real time. You cannot print oil. You cannot manufacture diesel in a government facility by decree. You cannot conjure fertilizer out of a press release. The physical world operates by laws that no amount of political confidence can override. When a critical artery of global energy supply is severed, even partially, even temporarily, the consequences do not announce themselves immediately. They build, they compound, They arrive on a delay that creates a dangerous illusion of normalcy. And then, without warning, the full weight of the disruption lands all at once. That is where we are headed, and the clock is running. Now I want to talk about something that the headlines are not capturing with the seriousness it deserves. The Strait of Hormuz was not closed by the laws of nature. It was not closed by an act of God. It was not even closed, strictly speaking, by Iranian aggression alone. It was closed by the cascading consequences of a war of choice, a conflict that began with strikes, that expanded into decapitation attempts, that failed to produce the intended political transformation inside Iran, and that has now evolved into a blockade strategy that appears to have no clear endgame. Here is what I need you to understand about the nature of blockades and about what it means to attempt to establish a security perimeter over a body of water as complex and contested as the southern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. You cannot build an invisible wall in open water. You cannot declare a security zone and make it impenetrable through the sheer force of your declaration. I have the deepest respect for the men and women of the United States Navy and the other services who are out there right now doing their jobs with professionalism and courage. But when you place guided missile destroyers in a contested maritime environment against an adversary that does not rely primarily on conventional naval assets, an adversary that uses unmanned surface vessels, fast attack craft, precision-guided missiles launched from terrestrial positions, and an integrated intelligence architecture that can see everything happening in that region from space, you are not creating a dome of protection. You are creating targets, and targets can be hit. The language emerging from the Pentagon briefings has been notable for what it promises and concerning for what it glosses over: a red, white, and blue shield, an enhanced security area, more than 100 aircraft in the air around the clock, the 82nd Airborne Division headquarters synchronizing operations. It sounds formidable. It is meant to sound formidable. But military operations are not evaluated on the quality of the press release. They are evaluated on results. And the result on the ground, in the water, right now, is that the strait remains effectively closed. Commercial insurance for tankers is largely unavailable through conventional markets, and the ships are not moving. 2 tankers were reported to have passed through under U.S. escort in the early hours of the operation. 2 others were reportedly attacked before they could complete the transit. 4 ships attempted, 2 succeeded, 2 did not. That is a 50% failure rate on day one of an operation that was presented to the world as a decisive assertion of American naval dominance. I am not saying this to undermine the effort. I am saying it because the truth matters more than the narrative, especially when lives and the economic stability of an entire nation are at stake. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about who is winning this confrontation and who is not. Let me tell you something about Iran that tends to get lost in the political commentary. Iran is not a paper tiger. I want to be precise here, because nuance matters when lives are on the line. Iran's conventional navy has been degraded. Their surface fleet has taken substantial losses. On that point, the briefings are not wrong. But the nature of modern asymmetric warfare is that a nation does not need a blue water navy to control a narrow strait. What Iran has demonstrated, with remarkable effectiveness, is the ability to leverage terrestrial-based missile systems, unmanned aerial and surface vehicles, and persistent space-based surveillance to achieve tactical effects that negate the conventional advantages of a superior naval force. Think about what that means strategically. You cannot destroy an adversary's ability to contest a waterway simply by sinking their ships if that adversary has moved the decisive layer of their capability onto land, into the air, and into orbit. The Iranians have built a system, and that system, operating in its home environment with interior lines of communication and persistent situational awareness, has the capacity to make passage through the strait extraordinarily costly, regardless of what forces we position in the region. This is not a political statement. It is a military assessment, and it is the kind of assessment that should be shaping the strategic decisions being made at the highest levels of our government. But here is where the picture becomes even more complex. and more consequential. Because this confrontation is not simply a bilateral affair between the United States and Iran. It never was. The geopolitical architecture surrounding this conflict involves players whose interests and capabilities significantly shape the range of possible outcomes. And one of those players is China. China is not watching from the sidelines. China has made it explicitly clear through direct government statements and through action on the ground that it does not intend to comply with secondary sanctions targeting companies that do business with Iran. Chinese state backing has been extended to companies sanctioned by the United States Treasury Department. That is not a passive stance. That is a direct, deliberate countermove. And it is happening in the context of a broader geopolitical realignment that extends well beyond the Strait of Hormuz. There is a port located on the coast of Pakistan on the Arabian Sea that represents exactly the kind of strategic infrastructure investment that shifts the balance of power in ways that cannot be addressed by naval positioning in the Strait of Hormuz. Built at enormous cost by Chinese investment, this port sits approximately 55 miles from the Iranian border. Road infrastructure connects it directly into Iran. Goods can move, energy, materials, supplies, through this corridor, bypassing the strait entirely. This is not a theoretical contingency. This is an active supply line. And the question that must be asked and answered is whether the United States is prepared to extend its military posture to interdict Pakistani port operations, knowing that doing so would place us in direct military confrontation with China. That question has not been answered publicly, and its absence from the public discussion tells you something important about the gap between the operational picture being presented to the American people and the actual strategic complexity of what we are engaged in. Now, I want to bring this closer to home, because all of this, the geopolitics, the blockade, the contested waterway, the Iranian response capability, the Chinese countermoves, ultimately converges on a single, unavoidable reality that will be felt not by admirals or analysts or political advisors, but by ordinary American families. Energy is the foundation of everything. Every truck that moves goods across this country runs on diesel. Every factory that produces the things you use runs on natural gas or electricity generated by hydrocarbons. Every bag of fertilizer that grows the food on your table is derived from natural gas feedstocks. Every bond yield, every credit rate, every mortgage payment is influenced by the price of energy, because inflation is downstream of energy cost. When energy becomes expensive, everything becomes expensive. When energy becomes scarce, the word we stop using is expensive, and the word we start using is shortage. We are not there yet, but the trajectory is clear to anyone who is reading the data honestly. Gasoline stockpiles at historic lows, fertilizer prices already beyond the reach of the majority of American farmers, a strategic petroleum reserve being drawn down to sustain a sense of normalcy that the underlying physical data does not support. Oil prices being managed, temporarily, artificially, through statements and market sentiment, while the physical reality of 12 to 15 million barrels of daily Middle Eastern output continuing to be constrained pushes in exactly the opposite direction. Markets respond to words in the short term. The physical world responds only to reality. And the reality is that the gap between the paper price of oil and the physical scarcity of energy cannot be sustained indefinitely. When it closes, and it will close, the adjustment will not be gradual. It will not be managed. It will be abrupt. But if you think that is the hardest part of this picture, you are not ready for what comes next. Because we have not yet talked about what this conflict is actually about at its deepest level. We have not talked about the strategic logic, or the absence of it, that brought us to this moment. And we have not talked about what happens when a great nation pursues a war of choice without clearly articulating to its own people why they are fighting, what victory looks like, and what they are prepared to sacrifice to achieve it. That conversation is the one that matters most, and it is the one that, so far, nobody in a position of authority has been willing to have. The American people deserve more than slogans. They deserve more than carefully worded briefings designed to manage perception rather than convey truth. They deserve the kind of leadership that stands before them, looks them in the eye, and says, "Here is where we are. Here is where we are trying to go. Here is what it is going to cost. And here is why it is worth paying that cost. That is what genuine wartime leadership looks like. That is what the weight of command actually demands. When you make the decision to put American men and women in harm's way, when you make the decision to engage a foreign military, when you make the decision to impose a blockade that disrupts the energy supply of the entire global economy, you do not get to manage that decision through press conferences and market sentiment manipulation. You own it, all of it, the casualties and the costs, the unintended consequences, and the strategic miscalculations. The allies who are watching and quietly making different arrangements, the adversaries who are learning, adapting, and positioning themselves to outlast you. Leadership is not a performance. It is a responsibility. And the weight of that responsibility does not diminish when the cameras are rolling. It increases. There is a moment in every mission, and I have lived through enough of them to know this with certainty, where the momentum of events begins to outpace the decision-making of the commanders directing them. It is a dangerous moment, not because the enemy has suddenly become more powerful, not because the terrain has shifted, but because the people in charge have allowed the operation to develop its own gravity, pulling everything forward, deeper, faster, while they stand at the back of the room, convincing themselves that control is still theirs. That moment, in my professional judgment, is where we are right now. Let me be direct with you about something that the political commentary continues to dance around without ever quite landing on. There is no coherent exit ramp visible in the current strategic posture. When you examine the stated objectives, the operational reality on the ground and in the water, the economic trajectory at home, and the geopolitical alignment forming around this conflict, you are looking at a situation in which every available path forward carries significant cost. And the longer the decision is delayed, the higher that cost becomes. That is not pessimism. That is operational mathematics. And operational mathematics does not care about your approval rating. Let us talk about the two paths that actually exist, because the American people deserve clarity rather than managed ambiguity. The first path is disengagement. Suspend operations. Acknowledge, without necessarily framing it as defeat, that military pressure has reached the limit of what it can achieve in this environment. Create the conditions for a diplomatic off-ramp that allows energy to flow, that reduces the economic pressure that is already building inside the United States and across the global economy, and that buys time for a more sophisticated strategic approach. This path carries real costs. It requires political courage of a kind that is increasingly rare. It requires a leader to stand before the American people and say something that no leader wants to say, that the assumptions we operated on were wrong, that the tools we reached for were not the right tools for this particular problem, and that the responsible thing, the genuinely strong thing, is to recalibrate rather than escalate. That is not weakness. I want to be unambiguous about this, because there is a tendency in our political culture to conflate stubbornness with strength. They are not the same thing. Stubbornness is what happens when ego overrides judgment. Strength is what happens when a leader makes the hard call, the unpopular call, the call that costs them something personally, because it is the right call for the people they are responsible for. I have seen real strength in combat. It often looks nothing like what gets celebrated in press conferences. The second path is escalation. Go back in, strike harder, attempt to break Iranian will through increased military pressure. This path is being quietly advocated for by voices who believe that the problem is insufficient application of force rather than a fundamentally flawed strategic premise. And I need you to understand what escalation actually means in the current environment, not as a political talking point, but as a military reality. Our precision-guided munition inventories have been significantly drawn down over the course of this conflict. The stockpiles of JASSM cruise missiles, Tomahawk variants, and interceptor systems including Patriot PAC-3 are not unlimited. They never were. The production rates for these systems cannot be rapidly accelerated to meet wartime consumption. What that means, practically, is that a return to sustained high-tempo strike operations would exhaust our most capable offensive and defensive munitions within a window of days to weeks, not months. After that, the options available to commanders on the ground become considerably less precise and considerably more costly in every dimension. And here is what escalation does not solve. It does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz on a timeline that prevents the economic damage that is already accumulating. It does not neutralize Iran's terrestrial-based missile capability, which is dispersed, hardened, and deeply embedded in a country the size of Alaska. It does not address the Chinese supply corridor through the Pakistani coast that is actively sustaining Iranian economic function outside the reach of the blockade. It does not reverse the de-dollarization trend that has been accelerating as international confidence in American strategic consistency erodes. And it does not bring back the allies whose trust has been quietly but steadily bleeding away over the course of this conflict. What escalation does do is generate more destruction, more instability, more upward pressure on global energy prices, and more justification for the international realignment that is already underway. The realignment away from dollar-denominated trade, away from American security guarantees, and toward alternative arrangements centered on powers that, whatever their many flaws, have not just demonstrated the capacity to destabilize the global energy supply through a war of choice. I want to pause here and speak to something that I believe is the most important and least discussed dimension of this entire situation. Because the military and economic dimensions, as serious as they are downstream of something more fundamental. They are downstream of strategic purpose. And strategic purpose requires an answer to a question that has not been honestly asked, let alone honestly answered. What is this war actually for? Not the stated rationale, not the press conference language, not the framing designed to make the action sound like a defensive response to Iranian aggression. The real answer, the answer that explains why this particular conflict, at this particular moment, against this particular adversary, was deemed worth the cost that is now accruing in treasure, in credibility, in economic stability, in the strategic position of the United States relative to its actual long-term competitors. Great nations have gone to war throughout history. Some of those wars were necessary, some were justified, some were both. But the ones that ended in strategic failure, the ones that consumed vast resources, damaged national credibility, and ultimately achieved nothing proportionate to the cost, shared a common characteristic. They were fought without a clear articulation of why they mattered, what victory looked like, and whether the tools being used were actually capable of achieving the stated ends. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The pattern is not obscure. It is well documented. It has been studied, analyzed, and written about at length. And yet here we are. Leadership demands more than managing the moment. It demands the courage to look beyond the moment, to ask not just what the next move is, but where the sequence of moves ends, and whether that ending point is actually worth what we are paying to reach it. Every commander I have respected in my career understood this. The ones who did not, the ones who allowed operational momentum and political pressure to substitute for strategic clarity, left behind legacies measured in unnecessary losses and avoidable failures. Now let me speak directly to the economic dimension, because this is where the abstract becomes personal for every American sitting at home right now, watching this unfold from a distance that is rapidly closing. The bond market does not care about political narratives. It cares about fiscal reality. And the fiscal reality of the United States at this moment is that we are carrying a debt load that makes elevated interest rates genuinely dangerous. Not inconvenient, not uncomfortable, but structurally threatening. Every percentage point of increase in the yield on 10-year treasuries adds enormous cost to the federal budget, crowds out productive investment, and pushes the mathematics of debt sustainability closer to a threshold that nobody in power wants to name publicly, but that serious financial analysts have been identifying for some time. Energy costs drive inflation. Inflation drives yield expectations. Yield expectations drive bond rates. Bond rates drive the cost of everything: mortgages, business loans, government borrowing. When you constrain 13 to 15 million barrels of daily oil output from a critical global choke point, you are not just making gasoline more expensive at the pump, you are pulling a thread that runs through the entire fabric of the global financial system. And the people on Wall Street who watch the oil price drop on a given day because a confident statement was made in the Oval Office, those people are reading the weather report, not the climate. The weather can look fine right up until the moment the storm arrives. Japan is defending its currency right now with tools that are running low. To sustain that defense, Japanese financial institutions may be compelled to liquidate holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. When that happens, not if, it adds pressure to yields that are already trending in a dangerous direction. China is actively reducing its dollar exposure. The de-dollarization trend is not a fringe concern raised by contrarian economists. It is a documented, measurable shift in the behavior of sovereign wealth funds, central banks, and bilateral trade agreements around the world. This is the real battle space, not just the water between Oman and Iran, not just the fast boats and unmanned systems and guided missile destroyers. The real battle space is the confidence of the world in the stability, the reliability, and the strategic judgment of the United States of America. And that confidence, once lost, is not recovered through a press conference. It is recovered slowly, painfully, incrementally through demonstrated competence, consistent leadership, and the kind of principled strategic clarity that inspires trust rather than demanding it. Here is what I know about recovery. I have seen units that were broken by bad leadership, by failed operations, by the accumulated weight of poor decisions made under pressure. And I have seen those units recover. But recovery never begins with denial. It never begins with doubling down on the approach that produced the failure. It begins with honesty, with a clear-eyed assessment of where you are, how you got there, and what it is actually going to take to get to a better place. It begins with a leader who is willing to absorb the discomfort of that honesty and act on it, rather than managing it, spinning it, or projecting confidence they do not actually possess.